Be sure he was. He followed me like a lover. He painted pictures on the chapel ceiling, slung from a chair. Torrigiano made us promise not to fight till the work should be finished. We were both master craftsmen, do you see, and he needed us. None the less, I never went aloft to carve without testing all my ropes and knots each morning. We were never far from each other. Benedetto would sharpen his knife on his sole while he waited for his plaster to dry. Wheat, wheat, wheat. I'd hear it where I hung chipping round a pillar head, and we'd nod to each other friendly like. Oh, he was a craftsman, was Benedetto, but his hate spoiled his eye and his hand. I mind the night I had finished the models for the bronze saints round the tomb. Torrigiano embraced me before all the chapel, and bade me to supper. I met Benedetto when I came out. He was slavering in the porch, like a mad dog. "Working himself up to it," said Mr. Springett. "Did he have it in at ye that night?" No. That night he kept his oath to Torrigiano, but I pitied him. Well, now I come to my own follies. I had never thought too little of myself, but after Torrisani had put his arm round my neck, I Hal broke into a laugh. I lay there was not much odds twixt me and a cock sparrow in his pride. "I was pretty middlin' young once on a time," said Mr. Springett. "Then you know that a man can't drink and dice and dress fine and keep company above his station, but his work suffers for it, Mr. Springett." "I never held much with dressin' up, but you're right. The worst mistakes I ever made, they was made of a Monday mornin'," Mr. Springett answered. "We've all been one sort of fool or t'other. Mr. Stan, take the smallest gouge, or you'll be splittin' her stem works clean out. Can't you see the grain of the wood don't favor a chisel?" I'll spare you some of my follies, but there was a man called Brigandine, Bob Brigandine, clerk of the King's ships, a little smooth, bustling atomy, as clever as a woman to get work done for nothing, a wonderful smooth-tongued pleader. He made much of me, and asked me to draft him out a drawing, a piece of carved and gilt scroll work for the bows of one of the King's ships. The Sovereign was her name. "Was she a man of war?" asked Dan. "She was a warship, and a woman called Catherine of Castile desired the King to give her the ship for a pleasure ship of her own. I did not know at the time, but she'd been at Bob to get this scroll work done, and fitted that the King might see it. I made him the picture in an hour, all of a heat after supper, one great heaving play of dolphins and a Neptune or so reining in webby-footed sea-horses, and Arion with his harp high atop of them. It was 23 foot long, and maybe 9 foot deep, painted and gilt." "It must have just about looked fine," said Mr. Springett. "That's the curiosity of it. 'Twas bad, rank bad. In my conceit I must needs show it to Torrigiano in the chapel. He straddles his legs, hunches his knife before him, and whistles like a storm-cock through a sleet shower. Benedetto was behind him. We were never far apart, I've told you. "That is pig's work," says our master. "Swine's work. You make any more such things, even after your fine court suppers, and you shall be sent away." Benedetto licks his lips like a cat. "Is it so bad then, master?" he says. "What a pity!" "Yes," says Torrigiano. "Scarcely you could do things so bad. I will condescend to show." He talks to me then and there. No shouting, no swearing. It was too bad for that. But good, memorable counsel, bitten in slowly. Then he sets me to draft out a pair of iron gates, to take, as he said, the taste of my naughty dolphins out of my mouth. Iron's sweet stuff if you don't torture her, and hammered work is all pure, truthful line, with a reason and a support for every curve and bar of it. A week at that settled my stomach handsomely, and the master let me put the work through the smithy, where I sweated out more of my foolish pride. "Good stuff is good iron," said Mr. Springett. "I done a pair of lodge gates once in 1863. "Oh, I forgot to say Bob Brygandyne whipped away my draft of the ship's scroll work, and would not give it back to me to redraw. He said 'twould do well enough. Howsoever, my lawful work kept me too busy to remember him. Body o' me, but I worked that winter upon the gates and the bronzes for the tomb as I'd never worked before. I was leaner than a lath, but I lived then." Hal looked at Mr. Springett with his wise, crinkled-up eyes, and the old man smiled back. "Ouch!" Dan cried. He had been hollowing out the schooner's after-deck. The little gouge had slipped and gashed the ball of his left thumb, an ugly, triangular tear. "That came of not steadying your wrist," said Hal calmly. "Don't bleed over the wood. Do your work with your heart's blood, but no need to let it show." He rose and peered into a corner of the loft. Mr. Springett had risen too, and swept down a ball of cobwebs from a rafter. "Clap that on," was all he said, "and put your handkerchief atop. 'Twill cake over in a minute. It don't hurt now, do it?" "No," said Dan indignantly. "You know it has happened lots of times. I'll tie it up myself. Go on, sir." "And it'll happen hundreds of times more," said Hal with a friendly nod as he sat down again. But he did not go on till Dan's hand was tied up properly. Then he said, "One dark December day, too dark to judge color, we was all sittin' and talkin' round the fires in the chapel. You heard good talk there. When Bob Brygandyne bustles in and, 'Hal, you're sent for,' he squeals. I was at Torrigiano's feet on a pile of putlocks, as I might be here, toasting a herring on my knife's point. 'Twas the one English thing our master liked, salt herring. 'I'm busy about my art,' I calls. 'Art?' says Bob. 'What's art compared to your scroll work for the sovereign? Come!' 'Be sure your sins will find you out,' says Torrigiano. 'Go with him and see.' As I followed Bob out, I was aware of Benedetto, like a black spot, when the eyes are tired, slittering up behind me. Bob hurries through the streets in a raw fog, slips into a doorway, upstairs, along passages, and at last thrusts me into a little cold room vilely hung with Flemish tapestries, and no furnishing except a table and my draft of the sovereign's scroll work. Here he leaves me. Presently comes in a dark, long-nosed man in a fur cap. "Master Harry Daw?" said he. "The same," I says. "Where a plague is Bob Brygandyne gone?" His thin eyebrows surged up in a piece and come down again in a stiff bar. "He went to the king," he says. "All one. Where's your pleasure with me?" I says, shivering, for it was mortal cold. He lays his hand flat on my draft. "Master Daw," he says, "do you know the present price of gold leaf for all this wicked gilding of yours?" By that I guessed he was some cheese-paring clerk or other of the king's ships, so I gave him the price. I forget it now, but it worked out to £30, carved, gilt, and fitted in place. £30, he said, as though I had pulled a tooth of him. "You talk as though £30 was to be had for the asking. None the less," he says, "your draft's a fine piece of work." I'd been looking at it ever since I came in, and 'twas viler even than I judged it at first. My eye and hand had been purified the past months, d'ye see, by my ironwork. "I could do it better now," I said. The more I studied my squabby Neptunes, the less I liked 'em, and Arion was a pure flaming shame atop of the unbalanced dolphins. "I doubt it will be fresh expense to draft it again," he says. "Bob never paid me for the first draft. I lay he'll never pay me for the second. 'Twill cost the king nothing if I redraw it," I says. "There's a woman wishes it to be done quickly," he says. "We'll stick to your first drawing, Master Daw. but £30 is £30. You must make